Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm Eric Perot, the Vice President for Research here at Northwestern University, and it's my privilege to welcome you to the Distinguished Public Policy Lecture featuring Professor Steven Chu, pioneering scientist, Nobel laureate, and the U.S. former Secretary of Energy for the United States. So before starting, I want to thank some of the organizers for today's event. So Andy Papachristos, where are you hiding? Oh, he's back here, who's the director of the Institute for Policy Research. Professor Ted Sargent, who's the executive director for the Treenens Institute of Energy and Sustainability, and Andre DeGovia, chair of physics and astronomy. These three groups, and really the teams that work with them, made today's event possible. So let's start by giving them a round of applause. Thanks. Steve, welcome to Northwestern. It's really a pleasure to have you on our campus. Your contributions to science and government have had tremendous impact around the world. And I want to highlight some of that impact by talking a little bit about how Northwestern has benefited from your many contributions. First, your seminal contributions in physics have become intertwined with the works of our Professor Jerry Gabriels in physics and astronomy. Jerry has achieved the world's most precise measurements of any fundamental particle property, studying electron magnetic moment to 1 part in 10 trillion. And I encourage you, just write out how many zeros there are in 10 trillion to get a sense for how incredible this achievement is. When Jerry's work, though, is combined with the fine structure constant measurements that Professor Chu has helped launch, this provides one of the most stringent tests ever of the Standard Model, which is the foundation of our current understanding of physics. Different benefits to Northwestern stem from your work as Secretary of Energy. In particular, the Joint Center for Energy Storage Research, which was a decade-long project led out of Argonne National Laboratory, involved many Northwestern faculties. We're a seminal partner in that initiative, which advanced battery technologies. And the legacy of that work continues on our campus today. We continue to have many exceptional faculty in our departments of chemistry, material science, and elsewhere around the university who have launched companies, done fundamental science, and really changed the way that we think about storing energy. And again, a lot of this would never have been possible without Professor Chu's work as the Secretary of Energy. Steve, the breadth of your work from physics to biology, which we just started talking about before I came up here, to government is really incredible, and it makes you a perfect choice for today's lecture. At Northwestern, you all know we pride ourselves in tackling important problems, and doing so by bringing people together who have very different perspectives and very different skill sets so that we can look at things from an interdisciplinary point of view. Just to give two examples, because a lot of this work happens in the university research institutes and centers. So for example, the Treenens Institute has faculty from every academic school at Northwestern except for music, which is an odd omission, but I'm sure Ted is working on that. This breadth of expertise allows the Institute to focus on the energy transition from carbon-based fuels to cleaner sources, making advances in fundamental science, translation, and really thinking about the challenging concepts of deployment and acceptance, which are some of the hardest things for us to tackle as scientists. As another example, the Institute for Policy Research is one of our oldest research institutes, founded in 1968. It supports over 40 faculty fellows across campus and 120 affiliates. And this group works together on challenging public policy issues and disseminates their findings broadly, including to politicians, in an effort to change society for all of us. So not only do our institutes conduct interdisciplinary work within those units themselves, but they also work together. And today's event is a really nice example of that. It's a partnership between Treenens and the Institute for Policy Research and their close colleagues in physics and astronomy. So thank all of you again today. I think this is a really nice opportunity to talk about a challenge that is truly interdisciplinary, which is greenhouse emissions. So Steve, we're looking forward to your talk. And before welcoming you up, I'd like to invite Andy Papachristos to introduce the lecture.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you and welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Happy Earth Month. Chicago weather not disappointing us today. It's a real privilege to welcome you to the distinguished lecture today with Dr. Chu, a Nobel laureate, pioneering scientist, former U.S. Secretary of Energy, and the feather in his cap, the first IPR Trinan's Team Up lecture. So thank you for that, doing that as well. And I wanted to highlight just a couple more things and put a pin in why this sort of coming together of our institutes and this lecture really matters. So Dr. Chu's groundbreaking research was recognized in the 1997 Nobel Prize for his work on laser cooling and optical trapping. This exemplifies the kind of interdisciplinary science that can address some of society's most pressing problems. And it is, as Eric just said in front of me, the things that we take seriously at Northwestern. Solving problems across disciplines, trying to take them into action. And, he is currently the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Physics, Molecular and Cellular Physiology, and Energy Science and Engineering at Stanford. At breakfast, he mentioned changing substantive research areas like 6 times in his career, and most of us barely get half a research subject before we do that. But really the innovation and thinking about how it pushes not just the science, but how we solve problems. And here, of course, I'm coming to think of something which he achieved in his time, in the cabinet position, being the first scientist in a cabinet position, was he was personally tasked by President Obama to help resolve the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Now think about that. That is science solving like a real problem. Coming in and doing that. And his telling of that story over breakfast really exemplified why having scientists involved inside these decision-making processes and policy processes is just so fundamentally important. We are very lucky to have him here today to talk about how we got to the place where we find ourselves today, where droughts, flooding, and extreme heat wave fundamentally alter the lives of people around the globe. As our climate continues to change, how will we meet this growing demand for food, for water, for energy? Drawing on his extensive experiences uniting diverse stakeholders, again, one of the key things we need to think about where science and policy are concerned at this very moment. And how are we going to do that to solve these complex challenges? Dr. Chu will share some of his insights from these opportunities and obstacles that we face on our path to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Briefly, before we get started, I want to remind everyone that we are collecting questions for a Q&A at the end, so please submit them from this QR code. It's also in your invitation, so if you check your email and you're looking for the QR code, and we'll try to get to those as quickly as we can. Finally, let me express my deepest gratitude to the co-sponsors, Ted and the Trinan's Institute, an amazing team to work with. Andre Degovia, thank you so much. Jerry and Vicky from Physics and Astronomy, really appreciate the partnerships for this great event. And now I'm honored to introduce Dr. Chu and Ted Sargent, who are going to, Dr. Chu is going to come up now, and Ted will come up later for the Q&A. So, Steve?
So, thank you very much for this very generous introduction. It's a delight to be here. It's my first time at Northwestern, hopefully not my last time. But without further ado, let me just begin. Just to remind you what's been happening, this is the temperature global record from 1850 to 2024. This is 1.5 degrees centigrade, so we're bubbling over 1.5. Another thing that I want to remind you of is the weather we see today is just not what was really going to happen, what's already baked into the system. The reason is very simple. Most of the heat, the additional heat being trapped by additional greenhouse gases, is going into the ocean. 90% is going into the ocean, very slow mixing. So what happens is it's going to take 50, perhaps 100 years to find out if we stop doing emissions today, what the new equilibrium is. So that's very, very disturbing because people usually say, well, what's really happening? It's not so bad. But they're not going to be around in the next 50 or 100 years. A lot of what we're worried about is due to climate models. This is from the last IPCC thing. And you've all seen these, many of you have seen these very convincing things. If you eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from humans, you'd expect something like this. But if you do this, you expect something like this. And it's comparing simulated to reserves. Looks very convincing, but let me warn you that it appears that we finally understand this, but the climate models actually have to be hand-tuned. If they're not hand-tuned, they tend to go unstable. And so that's one point that you should know. And the other thing is they're terrible at predicting precipitation. And whereas they're pretty good at temperature, precipitation is completely not in the cards for a couple of decades because the scale of precipitation are hundreds of meters, not kilometers. And so that's an issue. Precipitation is very important because if you have hotter summers, you have more coal for water and agriculture. But also, as mentioned, we're seeing some weird weather. There's weather variability. And there's a review article that came out in January of 2025, but it was written before the LA fires. And they were saying that we're seeing statistically large variations in variability. You can have wet years and you can have dry years. And the LA fires were exactly that. A very wet year, lots of vegetation, a very dry year, and it became a tinderbox. And so to what extent is this really going to be true? Again, climate models aren't going to tell us this. So it's really, what's going to really happen is based on statistics. So let's talk about where we're heading and where we want to be. So on the y-axis is the annual global emissions of greenhouse gases. And on the x-axis is time. Here's where we are now. We're a little bit higher than what are called current policies. Current policies are pledges made, for example, COP conferences. So assuming that the countries actually go through the pledges, unfortunately, in the last 3 months especially, there's been a pullback from these pledges. We don't know really what's going to happen, but if we assume we're in the current policies, we're heading towards about 3 degrees centigrade. These are the pathway scenarios for 1.5 and 2 degrees. And so by 2100, if you want to stay below 2 degrees, you have to eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions around the world. That's a really challenge. Another thing to keep in mind is that, what happened? Doesn't matter. I now need a timer. But anyway, another thing to keep in mind is that the World Bank is predicting maybe 200 climate refugees by mid-century. Most of those refugees will stay in the continents, but we've seen how 10 million, 15 million refugees, they go from poorer areas into Europe and the United States, have transformed world politics. So this is another thing that one has to consider. All right, so let's talk about the problem. Where's greenhouse gas emissions, where they come from? This is, again, an IPCC report, forestry, land use, electricity industries, things like that. So just let me remind you very quickly, all greenhouse gas emissions means we have to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from steel, concrete, plastics, chemicals, all forms of transportation. And you've got to eliminate from the food supply chain, which is 20 to 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Food supply chain around the world is much slower, and I'll go into this in more depth. We don't have many of the technologies. But before I start, I want to give you a little history. I think history study is very important. And so they're said that those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, yet those who do study history are doomed to stand by and helplessly watch while everyone else repeats it. So that's where we are. So let's talk about things and remind you about the first several industrial revolutions. This is the discovery of the steam engine, James Watt's improvement of the steam engine, and the transition from horse-drawn carriages to iron horses. And it was the beginning. But it was also there's a further materials invention that was needed. This materials invention was due to Henry Bessemer, who was actually working during a wartime, and they wanted the explosives for cannons were too powerful, and the cast iron cannons were breaking. So he invented a way of making steel. During the Crimean War, just to remind you, the Crimean War was that Russia invaded Crimea, and Europe England, France, and other countries came by to try to save it. So sounds familiar. Another reminder of how important materials are is that we all know of the first invention of the transistor at Bell Labs by John Martin and Walter Brattain in 1947. And then Shockley's name was not on the patent. He got really, technical term, was pissed off about this because they were in his department. So what he did is he first called him into his room and says, sometimes the people who do the work aren't going to get the credit. But then he locked himself up, and he was the big cheese in quantum physics applications to semiconductors. And over a period of a couple of days and nights, he developed most of the theory of semiconductor physics. So he does deserve the Nobel Prize, although I'm not really a nice person. But but it was the invention of the ability to purify first germanium and silicon that really made it take off. And so in Bell Labs, it wasn't for this invention of zone refining, for example, they couldn't have gone anywhere. And similarly, you also had the molten seed production of germanium. So it was that industrial materials application in high enough purity that made it happen. Know about fiber optics and another Nobel Prize, Charles Kao, but it was the high purity silicon developed by first Corning and then Bell Laboratories that made long distance transmission possible. So again, these are enabling technologies. And so similarly for photovoltaics, very much exciting developments in photovoltaics, perovskites and tandem perovskites and silicon solar cells. They now are producing, they're reaching 35% efficiency. The standard single crystal stuff is like 20%. So this is a huge improvement, very inexpensive stuff. Unfortunately, this advance was made by a Chinese company, Longji. And the great thing is the durability is really making headroads. And so they're beginning to push 25 years or more. And you get to this, the amount of energy to make these solar cells goes way down. And so very exciting stuff. But it's materials. So since I'm talking about materials, let me step back and tell you globally, where do we get these materials? Well, we get them from the Earth, fundamentally. And if you look at the stuff we drag out of the Earth in terms of sheer metric tons, it divides into two categories. One is the stuff we use, like concrete and asphalt and cement, to build things. And the other is oil, coal, natural gas. And then a little bit lower than that, steel. And then this is a log graph, so you're dropping by orders of magnitude. This blue stuff are plastics and chemicals from fossil fuel. So the next one is aluminum, copper, and zinc, and so on. So you're dropping by a couple of orders of magnitude. So most of what we drag out of the ground are fossil fuels and building materials. What else do I need to talk about? If you look at this and what are the long-term projections, we may face a copper shortage, maybe 50, maybe 100 years. And so what's going to happen there? Now, for these young people in the orange and material science, middle-aged and old people, if you can figure out how to turn carbon into a good conductor, which has conductivity to weight ratio, even close within a factor of 5 to copper, you have an inexhaustible amount of conducting material, because there is so much carbon in the ground. And this won't find its way into the atmosphere. So these are some of the things that I and others should be thinking about. So let's push on. We're going to need, I talked about revolutions, the fossil fuel, the steam engine, things like that, computer revolution, telecommunications revolutions. And we are seeing great strides in the solar and wind prices going down. The levelized costs, it's often said over the last 5-10 years, are dipping below natural gas prices, even in the United States, but in Europe especially. But in fact, they have to be perhaps twofold cheaper than natural gas, because the full cost of going to higher fraction renewables includes enhanced transmission, distribution, backup generation, all these other things. So that's an issue. So long-cost energy storage is crucial. And so let me show you a picture of my favorite battery. Here it is. Let me explain how it works. When the wind blows, you do the energy-intensive thing, for example, pumping water for irrigation. And when you want the irrigation, you open a valve. And so you don't need on-demand for many applications. And it turns out that 95% of all electrical energy storage is pumped hydro storage. If you have a turbine, you can have a turbine that goes both ways. And the round-trip efficiency, if you're, let's say, 80 or 100 feet, turns out to be 75% efficient. So the energy taken to lift the water up and the energy of gravity and then letting the water come back is comparable within striking distance of utility-scale flow batteries. So this is good news. So whenever you have an existing hydroelectric dam, turn it into an energy storage mechanism. Okay, let's talk about things you're more tuned to, just conventional chemical batteries. So in this plot, I'm showing on the x-axis energy per unit weight, on the y-axis energy per unit volume. This is the Tesla battery that's made its way into the S, the Y, the 3. There, in the near-term future, I'm projecting that the energy density will be up here, significantly higher energy per unit weight and energy per unit volume. This is not a fond hope. I'm on the board of a battery company. They're now selling batteries that are 450 to 500 watt hours per kilogram, and selling the stuff. So this will find its way. It takes 5 years to find its way into automobiles, but right now it's pretty good for drones. The cost of batteries is crucial. And so here is, on the y-axis is cost. This is on a log scale. So this is $10,000, $5,000, $2,000 per watt hour. And it's plunging, plunging, plunging. And so these are the drop in prices. If you see this, if you go up by orders of magnitude in deployment and you go down exponentially, it's a log scale, so a straight line means you're exponentially improving price. That's called the learning curve. The slope of the learning curve, there's no fundamental physics that says what the slope is, but virtually every technology establishes a learning curve until something happens. For example, the learning curve for Moore's law stuff is near the end because you're now at 2 nanometers. And so what happens with learning curves? Well, part of the problem that happens with learning curves is it could be a materials problem. Will there be enough cobalt, nickel, and lithium? Already, manufacturers are switching to iron phosphate instead of cobalt and lithium for the lower-end EVs, but that's going to go further, even though the batteries have less energy density. Lithium, will we run out of lithium? And the answer is not for a couple hundred years. We started looking at this. This is Chung Lu, who's an assistant professor. She may have tenure by now, University of Chicago. She was a graduate student at East Way and a postdoc of mine. We worked on lithium extraction of seawater, but there are other people working on this. And so where do we get our lithium today? We pump huge amounts of salty water, underground water, up into a lake, and we let the water evaporate. When you pump underground water up to the surface, you're bringing all sorts of muck, contaminants up to the surface, and you're pumping a lot of water, and so the freshwater table sinks down and becomes salty water. So it's bad in many ways for freshwater supplies, but also just really yucky stuff that you brought to the surface. There are now pilot projects using direct lithium extraction. For example, if you take salty water and the lithium is preferentially absorbed in a resin, you can get the lithium. You pump 99% of the water back underground, so you're not contaminating the surface, and it's already being tried in the United States. So this is a good thing. I'm pretty confident that this way of extracting lithium is going to come to be widely commercially available. When you drill for oil and gas, it's not uncommon to get a lot of what is called produced water. Sometimes the produced water is much more volume than the oil and gas. The lithium value in that salty water is more value than the oil. So I was advising Shell for a bunch of years. I hope to see the day when you go looking for lithium and you find oil and gas and you stick it back underground, if there are better solutions. So EVs could replace a lot of the demand for oil and gas, and this is the Tesla Model 3, range 360 miles. This is the base bottom price, $35,000. And you can charge in the sweet spot of like 30 to 60 or 70%. You can charge at 250 kilowatts. And so you can go 200 miles in 15 minutes. Now, you want to be better than that. For a decade, I've been saying we want the battery to last longer than the human bladder. What that means is you pull up while you're discharging, the car is charging. 5 minutes is about enough time to wash your hands and then go into the store and buy those junk that they make their money on. And so this is an example of a BYD, same price, a little bit faster acceleration. It can charge 250 miles in 5 minutes. Now, what's going into the magic of this battery, we don't know. There are no, by the way, that's a megawatt connector. This is pretty heavy. But certainly 500 kilowatts is completely handleable. And so we're making great progress. The only trouble is the Chinese are making better progress. Again, in my perch on the board of a battery company, we have this great battery. We're probably the only other player, and the rest of the competition are Chinese. And the innovation, a lot of innovation, raw innovation is now coming from China. So, so more about energy storage. Hydrogen is a form of energy storage, various colors of hydrogen. If you take natural gas out of the ground, you can create hydrogen and CO2 ultimately, and it has a certain cost. Blue hydrogen is you capture the CO2, and green hydrogen is use carbon-free energy to make hydrogen. Hydrogen has potentially a lot of applications. It could be used to as a reduction agent for steel production instead of a coking process. It's a ground thing for steel, chemicals, plastics, aviation fuel in principle. So it's all very good. If you're going to use electrochemistry, the current electrolyzers use too much of the precious metals, so you have to greatly reduce that. Hydrogen is very leaky, and we have no optical means of detecting hydrogen. Optical is very important because it allows remote sensing. It's only with remote sensing we knew how bad the methane leakage rate was. So the only ways are by mass spectrometry and a chemical detector that could be renewed. The good news is we have drones, and they're getting better. And so before you have hydrogen pipelines, you need to actually detect hydrogen, but that's not impossible. The new kid on the block is mining hydrogen. It hasn't been done commercially. The idea is you inject into deep, hot rock with Fe2 chemical state, iron 2+, and you can get hydrogen, and so you produce hydrogen coming out. For that reason, it's called white hydrogen. 4 years ago, the oil companies were saying, this is not going to work. 2 years ago, they went dark. And then all sorts of little companies are starting to pop out. Can you produce hydrogen? Now, since it's not a proven technology. It's not even really demonstrated. The prices are going to 50 cents a kilogram. What the real price is, we don't know. But it could, in principle, be very low. All right. So what about electricity demand? We have EVs. We want to electrify a lot of things. Instead of gas stoves, we want induction heating. Instead of gas water heaters, all this stuff. So one of the big drivers in electricity demand could be or is becoming demand in data centers. So this is an article written in 2015 where the green are the electricity demand in data centers. This is networks, wired and wireless. But this was written before machine learning and AI took off. And so there's profound impacts on the energy demands because machine learning and AI are insatiable in their energy demand. I should also point out about a third of these compute centers are used to mine cryptocurrency. You have to demonstrate that you have to pay some price, so they decided on some silly algorithm that uses a lot of power. So I'm not a fan of cryptocurrency because the first applications were money laundering and things like that. But in any case, there's where we are. The demand for machine learning, this is time from 1960 to this is 2022. And all of a sudden, there's the number of parameters used in machine learning is 1.8 trillion parameters using 10x more than GPT-3. And the machine learning now is using about 10 billion petaflops, 10 to 12 floating point operations per second. So it's a huge, huge, insatiable appetite. And this can grow by easily an order of magnitude or more. And so there's a huge effort both on the chip level to make the chips much more energy efficient. NVIDIA is now 100 times more efficient, but still very energy intensive. Their latest chip is a kilowatt per chip. There's huge incentive in the algorithms to be efficient, all sorts of things. But here's what I think we should aspire to. And so it goes like this. Here on the left, you see, say, a 4-year-old. And she can learn how to distinguish between if mother and father speak different languages. If they're wealthy, they may have a nanny who speaks a third language. By 4 years old, they're fluent in all of them. They can easily translate they know which parent speaks which language. They know the difference between cats and dogs. And what's the energy? 70 watts, of which 35 goes to the brain. Okay? And here's another young toddler who's doing experiments in physics. And but look at the data. The data is orders and orders of magnitude less. And yet they're able to piece it together. I should say that the person on the left is a childless lover of cats. Sorry. In any case, most of what we want in artificial intelligence and machine learning are that pattern recognition stuff. It's not deep compute, numerical stuff. And so we have an existence proof that there are many, many orders of magnitude to be had. Okay, so let's talk about, suppose renewable energy does achieve a factor 2 decrease from what it is today. Where are we going to be? We're still going to need turn-on sources, compact sources. Maybe less in the United States, but certainly in other places you'll need that. And so the choices for compact turn-on sources are fossil fuel, coal or natural gas, or nuclear fission with spent fuel disposal. Let me talk briefly about nuclear fission and the fears of contamination, radiation, the inability to build large reactors on budget, on time, and then there's the spent fuel disposal issue. So let's talk about safety. If you look at the deaths caused by per terawatt hour of generated energy, A brown coal leads it because of the air pollution, the small particulate matter, their SOx, NOx, everything else. But by black coal, followed by oil. Biomass is still pretty high up there. Where is nuclear? Nuclear is down here. It's somewhere between wind and solar, and 2 orders of magnitude safer than burning wood pellets. Okay, so that's something to think about in terms of the deaths caused by this. The other thing to think about is about a third of the radiation, average radiation of Americans, background radiation, is in the food we eat. We eat radioactivity. And because of that, there's a new unit of radiation called a banana equivalent dose. 1 banana is a certain dose of radiation. I gave a talk in South Korea, and it turns out that a cup of bok choy is the same. And so BED can be bok choy equivalent dose. But it's not just bananas. It's in all the green stuff we eat. It's in carrots and potatoes and meat and everything. Okay, Brazil nuts are particularly high. And so now the health people, FDA, says, does that mean you shouldn't eat your spinach or bananas or anything else? And they said, no, because background radiation varies by a factor of 4 or 5, and there's no correlation between background radiation and incidence of cancer. So at these low background levels, there is no correlation. So I said, and it's better for your diet if you eat all these other things. What about building budgets on time, on budget? Well, it turns out if you look at all the big projects, 92% of them are over budget. Three Gorges Dam, Space Station, the Big Dig in Boston. These are huge cost overruns in the many billions of dollars. There's a book on how big things get done, and it says 92% of them are over budget, and there's a list of things, by just pick out a few things, like plan slow, act fast, find your Lego, build it from a simple building block, and then build up in complexity, and know that the biggest risk is your own hubris. And so these are things. So now, going forward, can we learn to build gigawatt reactors on budget on time? I don't know. But there's a possibility that we can build small modular reactors, because there you can have a learning curve. If you start punching out thousands of these reactors each year, you get down this learning curve, and it can go from bigger scale. This is the scale I found on the web. This is a person, and this is a very small Volkswagen or a very big basketball player. I don't know. But this is a new technology. The first of them have been approved by the NRC, NuScale. And I funded this when I was Secretary of Energy, wrote an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal my first year saying, we think we want to support this, so we're helping with engineering designs. One that I'm particularly excited about is X-Energy, which has very hard ceramics around the nuclear fuel. Why is this exciting? Because the confinement of the radiation is in this hard pellet. It's kind of millimeter size. After you're done with the fuel, you can take the pellets and you can pump them underground using oil technology in a fluidized bed. So you can go kilometers deep and you can go sideways in rock formation that you won't normally have the ability to access for money's sake. And so there again is a possibility. Okay. When will fusion be commercially deployed? I'm not going to talk about it. You can talk about it later. The answer is probably 40 years to never. But I want to talk about the need for a fourth agricultural revolution. What was the third revolution? The third revolution was that they found out how to make nitrogen-based fertilizers, ultimately from nitrogen in the air. It got Fritz Haber a Nobel Prize in 2018 for the Haber-Bosch process. They realized it was an oversight, so they gave it to Karl Bosch in 1931 for the Haber-Bosch process, high temperature, high pressure catalysis. So it got 2 Nobel Prizes. Another Nobel Prize was given to Norman Borlaug, this time for peace, for being able to crossbreed plants, hybrid strains, starting with wheat that could sustain more irrigation, more fertilizer, And they're dwarf strains because the kernels got so big that the wheat would fall over. And so the productivity of these wheat strains was really much higher. The combination of irrigation, fertilizer, and crossbreeding of plants meant in the world, we went in 1961 from 3 billion people to 2021, 7.9 billion people. This is the land put under cereal production. Cereal is wheat, rice, corn, sorghum, things like that. And this is the production. So without this agricultural revolution, we couldn't feed a world of 8 billion people. So it was truly a revolution. But there are consequences. For example, the animals we eat emit a lot of methane, especially ruminant animals like beef. And so this is the greenhouse gas issues of some of the food we eat. This is beef up here. If you want to eat meat and you're concerned about your impact, a chicken is an order of magnitude less greenhouse gas, which is still more than rice or bread and things like that. But it is significant. If beef and dairy cows around the world were a country, and you compare it to the total greenhouse gas emission of countries, this is old data 2020. This is China here. It's now doubled, roughly doubled. It's tripled out of the United States is flat. EU has gone down. And this is where beef and dairy cows would be. So more greenhouse gas emissions than all of the EU plus Great Britain or the US. It's a big deal. Now, here's a quiz. I'm a professor. You put on one side of the scale humans, the human mass, and the animals we eat. And the other side of the scale, let's say all the mammals in the world besides stuff we eat. Which weighs more? How many say all the other stuff? How many say human and animals? Okay, you know what it is? It's humans and animals 20 times more. 20. Only 5% of the mammal mass is not stuff we eat. So this is profound geoengineering. Okay, so if you say we don't want geoengineering, sorry, too late. Now, we can do something about methane from cows. You can change the diets. People are thinking of inoculating them. You can't say don't eat beef. That's the third rail. But you can do other things. N2O is a very different story. You put fertilizer in the ground. The fertilizer is not absorbed by the plants. Microbes turn into N2O. N2O is a greenhouse gas that's lasts 100 years and is 300 times worse than CO2. And so even though it's a tiny fraction, it's going to grow because the fertilizer, and as wealth grows in developing countries, it's going to grow. Whereas you can say, well, carbon dioxide, we're beginning to get a handle on. Methane, we're beginning to get a handle on. We don't have a handle on N2O. And so there may be biological ways of doing this. So there's a field called synthetic biology where you can reprogram, let's say, microbes to put in whole metabolic pathways. This could be useful for drugs, but it could also be useful for getting microbes to enter into symbiotic relationships with plants. The proof of principle is legumes have this already, and so they don't need that much fertilizer. In fact, crop rotation was to restore the soil. And so there's a company in the Bay Area called Pivot Bio, and the synthetic biology part was done by another company called Zymergen, which I was on the board of. And they were able to make microbes that reduced the fertilizer input of corn by a factor of 2. Sounds great, except it was only a factor of 2. Development time was 8-9 years. Too slow. Zymergen went bankrupt. And so why did they take so long? Because these are microbes. Doubling time is pretty fast. It's because you can only insert one gene, one promoter at a time. And if the solution was 12 genes and you have to optimize, it takes many years. So in my own lab, I have a little side project saying, can we put in 15 genes at once? And so you can do that because you can type out the genes, and you can now combinatorially do the search with hundreds or thousands of experiments. And so we need this technology. Synthetic biology has not taken off because of this is one of the bottlenecks. So that's something that we can think about. Let me go to carbon capture. The sad news is, based on our current trajectory, we're not only going to go over 450, we'll go over 550 parts per million. And as I said before, it's coming from everywhere. And so if you include nitrous oxide and methane, depending on how you average, it can be on the scale of 50 billion tons of CO2 per year. And because of hard-to-abate things like agriculture, aviation fuels, things like that, we're going to need to capture maybe 20 billion tons a year. Put that in the scale, all of landfill in the world is 2 billion tons. And so we're talking about an order of magnitude. It's actually in volume much more than order of magnitude, but the density of compressed carbon dioxide is like 0.7 that of water, whereas landfill is higher density. So where's technology today? This is a project that I funded when I was Secretary of Energy in Louisiana. It was taking 1/4 of the carbon dioxide from a coal plant, a medium-large coal plant, and using amines. And so CO2 would be captured on these amine molecules in water droplets. And then after they're captured, you heat up the water droplets and you regenerate it. So it captured 92% of the CO2, about 1.4 million metric tons a year. Remember, we're 10 gigatons. We're shooting for 10 gigatons. And it uses 30% of the power of the power plant, and it costs $1 billion. It actually came on budget on time. Okay, so think about that. It ain't going to be deployed. The cost is too high, and the energy cost is too high. And so, and how big is this? This is a very large pickup truck. So this is a block, and 1/4 of one coal plant. Okay, so now the energy used is nowhere near the theoretical energy. The theoretical energy is governed by the second law of thermodynamics. You do not violate second law of thermodynamics, which says, if left in a closed system, entropy increases or remains the same. And if you start with a concentrated thing, you can go dilute. So if you will go from dilute to concentrate, you have to put energy in. Okay? So that's easy to calculate what it is. When you capture from 8% to 1 atmosphere, so you can then compress and put underground, for example, it's in units. I happen to be using kilojoules per mole of carbon dioxide. It can be anything you want, but just it's a unit number, and it's less than 5. From 400 parts per million, since it's the logarithm, because entropy is the log of the number of successful states, it only increases to less than 20 kilojoules per mole. Okay, but they're using 100, 200. Air capture, they're using 500 kilojoules per mole. And so we stumbled on a new way. And let me just briefly describe how it works. It first is coming from the fact that it's known for decades that if you have water at very high pH, you can absorb a good fraction of a mole of carbon dioxide. And if you shift the pH to below 6, you're giving up a couple orders of magnitude in the concentration of CO2. So basic water, big sponge for CO2, you shift the pH, out it comes. And so that has gotten the attention of a lot of people. Klaus Leichner and David Keith used water in high alkalinity, but they had to get it out. So it was very energy intensive. Electrochemists said, hey, I can do this. I can shift the pH electrochemically, and maybe I can do better than that. And so, for example, when the pH changes by 7, that's 7 orders of magnitude change in the proton concentration. But what does that mean? High pH, low protons. Low pH, high protons. You're doing the same. You go from low to high. You have to pay an entropy price. The entropy price of shifting pH by making more protons is bigger than the cost of concentrating CO2. It's still okay, but it's still bigger. And so we discovered quite by accident we could shift the pH well below the thermodynamic limit. Okay, so what's going on? Did we make a mistake? And so let me describe this. I described already going from low concentration, high concentration as a minimum thermodynamic limit. So how can you change the pH without changing the proton concentration? I didn't know. So we're in group meeting and say, hey, something weird is going on. Let's Google what pH means. Okay? pH is minus the logarithm of the proton concentration times a fudge factor called the activity factor. And what's the activity factor? We scratch around a little bit more and say, well, if you have a high concentration of stuff, the combined effect could be making the effective concentration higher or lower, and so it's a fudge factor. And so we're finding we're able to change the fudge factor by 7 orders of magnitude. So how is that possible? Okay, so here's the model. In this molecule, it's a very common organic molecule called tempo, considered very inexpensive. If you oxidize it, the nitrogen becomes slightly charged. And in this molecular dynamic simulation, here's a water molecule, oxygen, 2 hydrogens. It polarizes the water. So the protons are more likely to dissociate, but you don't want to make protons. But then you have to pay the entropy price. Suppose a reaction that combines protons with bicarbonate to form neutral carbonic acid that goes to CO2 and water, and you use up a proton. Then when you use up this proton in this cartoon, that proton gets supplied by the polarized water molecule. And so it doesn't make new protons, but if you use up a proton, it says, here's another one. You're in war. A soldier dies or gets wounded. Here's a new soldier, okay? Same standing army. And so because this is soluble up to a fraction of a mole, which is a lot of polarized water molecules, you can actually have a source of standby protons. How do we know this is true? We have these charged molecules, tempo, and we start dumping in KOH, strong base. So OH minus gobbles up the protons. As you gobble up the protons, the pH doesn't change. It's buffered. And then all of a sudden, the pH changes. At what point does the pH change? When you've thrown in so many OHs, you've used up, they're equal to the number of oxidized tempo molecules. And it says once you use up a proton, the OH clings around the molecule and it's used up. But because it's your fraction of a mole and it's super cheap, you can do this. Okay. So very, very exciting. Another thing is if you look at the plans of Climeworks and carbon engineering, huge fans, because the rate limiting step are the amount of gas going into solution. And so you get these huge blower fans, and so that's a big problem. We haven't done anything about this so far, but there's something else on the block. There's an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, and this enzyme is developed by nature when you metabolize energy in human body and other living organisms. Your byproduct is water and CO2. You've got to get the CO2 out into the lungs. And so they developed an enzyme that increases the solubility of CO2 into the blood by 7 orders of magnitude. When I was Secretary of Energy, I was sponsoring research to develop carbonic anhydrase that could be durable in a flue gas environment of high temperature, 100 plus centigrade, and very bad stuff. It never caught fire because, developing these variants of carbonic anhydrase were hard. But this is different because now we're at room temperature. And there are carbonic anhydrases that have been made to work at high pH, 11. And so we haven't tried this yet. We don't require 7 orders of magnitude. You get an order of magnitude, you just decrease the electricity bill of the fans by an order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude. And so the last remaining bit of energy goes away. And so going back to this idea of how it works, you get CO2, you expose the CO2 to water, you oxidize it, the pH changes from 11 to 6, it comes out. On the return path, it gets reduced. If the pH of reduction and oxidation is pH independent, then it takes energy to take an electron off, you get it coming back. So what's the loss now? It's resistive loss. And so now, we weren't that smart. We were thinking of putting amines on TEMPO and surgically breaking electrochemically that TEMPO bond. It worked, great. Do the next thing. Is CO2 attached to the amine? No. Get rid of the amine, hydroxy, worked just as well. pH is changing. What the hell's going on? And so now I know what the real definition of pH is. So it pays. The moral of the story is, if there's a choice between lucky and smart, always take lucky. Okay, so anyway, so this is very exciting. We have yet to try the carbonic anhydrase and higher pHs. There's a few things that need doing. How durable is it? It's got to last for a year or so. It's really cheap stuff, but it still should last. Having said all that, photosynthesis is still a very good way of capturing CO2 because the power is kind of free. And so that's why reforestation is important. But mature forests actually capture very little CO2, and the sign may change depending on the forest because of methane production, things like that. So I'm going to propose a new way of capturing CO2. It's a material, because this is materials talk, and the material is called wood. So you can build structural, instead of steel and concrete, you can build wooden structures. And so the wooden structures, this is a 20-story building instead of steel and concrete, but most buildings are 4 or 5 stories. Fire safety, not a problem. You can have it. It's safer than steel. Because if you look in steel beams anywhere in this building, some uses spray insulation stuff, that is there because when the fire gets very hot, the steel softens and the building collapses. And so it's there to build. The fire code wants you to say, get 30 minutes to get people out of the building before it collapses. And so wood is actually as good as steel. It actually could be better. So that's, and you can make wood last a long time. So if you reward people for building buildings and not tearing them down in 50 years, but making hundreds of years, you're sequestering carbon for that amount of time. So inclusion, where we're heading. So let me quote the greatest American philosopher of the 20th century, and just in case you're wondering who that is, that's Yogi Berra. And he said, we're lost, but we're making good time. So what are the issues involved? If you look at, it's been drummed into our heads that energy consumption is everything. It improves quality of life. So in this axis is Human Development Index. It includes GDP, life expectancy, and years of schooling as a measure of the wealth of the country, not just GDP, versus electricity consumption per capita. When you're a very poor country, you want as much energy as you can get, but then it plateaus. And so here's Denmark over here. Iceland doesn't matter, Norway doesn't matter because, hey, electricity is free, but over here it plateaus. And so one of the things is we need a new definition of wealth because the economists worship the altar of GDP. I tried when I was in the Obama administration to convince them this is not a good metric. And so what do we really care about our lives? What we care about if we're of a certain wealth is we want to send our kids down to the park on their own. They won't be mugged. They won't be sold drugs. We want to have health, vitality in our old age. And so this is a quote of Robert Kennedy Sr., who said, "The gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. Measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our dedication to the country. It measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile. 1 month before he was assassinated. Very sad. The transition, how long will it take? In the United States, wood to coal. Coal to natural gas, petroleum. Looks like 60 years. And you see beginning slivers of non-carbon, okay? Looks pretty good. Globally, worldwide, what's happening? Every time there's a new source of energy, we just add to the mix. So this is where we're heading. And so I'm going to play you a little movie clip. I hope it works. This is from the movie Titanic. If those of you who've seen it, it's good. If those of you who haven't seen it, you should see it. The kids on the crow's nest are just seeing the iceberg. They're reversing the engines. They're trying to turn the ship.
Why ain't they turning? Is it hard over? It is, yes, sir, hard over.
Okay, so you know what happens. It takes 3/4 of a century to turn the ship. If you work really hard, a half a century. It just takes a long time. Does that mean we shouldn't try as hard as we can now? Absolutely, you have to try as hard. But don't be fooled into thinking by 2050 we're carbon neutral. And so with that, I'd be happy to have question and answer. Thank you. I didn't turn off the lights.
I don't know about you, Steve, but I need to take a seat after that talk. And I was sitting during that talk, so I can imagine you might need one too. I got a whole bunch of questions from the audience that I'm going to get to. Sure. But I wanted to start with policy. I think we were all moved and had some of the same reactions in your quote from RFK Sr. And I think we probably were all wondering, I know I was, what can we do? It feels like especially the landscape of government and policy is going through rapid transformation, yet we all want to do things. So how do we engage in the current environment to have the kind of impact that we all want to have?
Well, first, what you value or what you think is a metric becomes the goal. GDP, the way it is now, encourages consumption. It encourages use once, throw away, because that increases GDP. Don't build a building for 500 years. Build it for 50. Throw it away. Don't make things last. A 32-year-old car. I hope it's the last car I own, but in my life. But this consumption, use once, throw away, has to fundamentally change. The idea that you want more young people to support a smaller aging population is great, except you realize, no, that's a Ponzi scheme. And if you look at the evolution now is people go into wealth, they have fewer kids. And so rather than saying we want to stimulate population growth and reward people for having more kids, you say, no. The short term there is going to be a labor shortage. In the long term, AI, machine learning, automation is going to further continue. And so let's start thinking about this transition to robotic things so that you can improve the standard of living per person and take care of an aging population. There's no law of physics that says this can't be done. In fact, it should be done because the machine learning AI part is going to be the last industrialization where there's no longer going to be those jobs. So if the population shrinks, this is a good thing. So let's start thinking about how to make the transition. So I think you should start this amongst yourselves, the conversation amongst yourselves. Other than that, personal habits matter, and talking to your friends and relatives matter. And in the end, though, the other thing, my message is that climate change is happening. I talked about a lot of new technologies. The people who invented and own those new technologies are going to be part of wealth creation. And so if you don't care about sustainability, but you care about improving the wealth of you, your family, and the country, hey, this is good enough. And so we need some voices to say this is part of wealth creation. There's a reason why China wants to own all these technologies, because they've decided decades ago that this is the future.
Thank you, Steve. Let me build. I have two directions I want to go. One is related to the role of industry, including industry advocacy, in influencing our course forward. And then the next one is the role of government. And obviously on government, you had your own contributions and impact that we already described in the introduction, and then it's been undergoing changes as to how I think we envision the role of government. But let's start with industry. You mentioned just now, from a purely economic perspective, there's a lot of commercial actors that are very just economically motivated to create, to build value, to create value, and often that can also serve a sustainability agenda. What would you call for from industry and from industry leaders for them to use their considerable influence for both economic and climate benefit?
Well, I think it goes back to, Congress does listen to industry. They listen to industry actually more than they listen to academics. When academics say, I want more funding, they say, just pigs feeding at the trough. Although many of them realize that the wealth creation is actually coming out of the research being done in universities, not only science and technology, but writ large. But we want other people to speak out, to say, if you talk about wealth creation and things like that, this is really important. You talk about national security and things like that, this is all very important. And and protectionism, like tariffs, don't actually engender good habits. And so the only reason what we have to do is we have to become competitive. We have to, we're still, in terms of basic raw new ideas, I think the United States is still, a huge leader. China has developed what we did in 50 or 100 years ago. They take existing technologies and make it better. But the science in China and the technology in China is getting better. So rather than seeking political protection, we have to say, what do we need to do in order to actually get back to the same thing we used to do 100 years ago? And I still think we're very capable of doing that. And so, the creativity is still there. And so we've got to harness that.
And that does take us to government. You've gone there already. If you were to look over maybe the last decade or decade and a half, I think there's a perception that the earlier part of that decade included really proactive, if you like, interventionist government roles in the advancement, the development, even the scaling of technological solutions, some of which were maybe baked and some of which weren't even fully baked. I think the idea was to kind of help them bake with major infrastructure investments. More recently, we're looking at administrations that are thinking more of letting sort of free market economics take their course, but with all sorts of tariffs. Anyway, I'm not sure I want to try to characterize that. I would rather you characterize, what do you think is, I guess one of the questions might be, is there a middle road? Like, is there a path where government can make a really material impact on American competitiveness, talent development, technological development, and sustainability in a way that takes kind of an appropriate and a balanced strategy?
Well, okay, so, if governments are taking a really proactive stand and subsidizing industries, then I think I would say, there's a call for the U.S. government to help, level the playing field. But the reaction tends to be overprotection. And so I'm a little bit concerned about that. So the end, I still think America can rise to the challenge. Now, in rising to this challenge, we're also doing something else where a lot of the technology and innovation and everything else is coming from immigrants. And immigrants have added to the vitality of this country. The great thing about the United States is you can be an immigrant, you'll be accepted, your children will definitely be seen as American. You can be fourth and fifth generation German or Swiss, you're considered foreign. And so the natural tendency of the American public is we're an open, inviting culture. And so we do not want to destroy that, because that's a lot of what, you know, led to our success. And so there's a lot of things at stake here, and there's a lot of things that one can do. And if we lose, we had these gifts from Nazi Germany, from the Chinese Revolution in '49, all these gifts, but those gifts are going away. And so we have to take stock of who we are, the great virtues we have in this country, and just play on those strengths.
Maybe I'll add a gift. As you say, we got those gifts that weren't our own doing, but then we did take some steps that were proactive and of our own doing. And I would say that major investments in basic science are another example of where the U.S. has a remarkable history. Maybe basic and applied along the spectrum. I mean, including some war and post-war projects, but then the follow-on investments after that. Do you want to say a little bit about how basic science fits into this? Obviously, it's part of the policy landscape, and it's part of the economic and the talent landscape.
Well, it has a long storied history where discoveries in basic science that you wouldn't think would be applicable in any way whatsoever have turned out to be tremendously valuable. Quantum mechanics, invented in 5. Without quantum mechanics, there would be no laser. There would be no semiconductor industry. And who would have thought in 1925 that you would have a basis for several industries, no telecommunications, none of this stuff. GPS, general relativity is used in GPS, global position satellites. It's really crazy stuff. And biomedical information, a lot of that, its roots were all in basic understandings of biology. And so this is a long, long track record going way back that says, you don't have to wait forever. Now, a lot of this basic stuff stays as basic stuff. It's not applicable, but it doesn't matter, because you have these huge other things that have transformed and created new industries and new wealth and better society. And so I think the core is, if you give up basic science and just go to the applied stuff, then you're sacrificing this future. And there's too much history that says, no, you have to keep that core there.
Thank you. I'm going to ask my next question, but as I do, I'm going to be picking up this iPad. It's going to be looking like I'm checking my email, but I'm actually not checking my email. I know that using that QR code, this audience put in about 400 questions. I'm going to try to get through all of them in the 3 minutes that remain. But before I even look at it, because I can't talk and read at the same time, I'm going to ask you the last question that's very much from me. Oh, here's what it was. I saw a talk a couple of weeks ago by Energy Secretary Chris Wright, in which he was speaking, amongst other topics, he was speaking about the role of the national labs, specifically the Department of Energy National Labs. And he was very passionate about the fact that these are another jewel. These are something that bring tremendous value to the ecosystem. He then actually focused in particularly on the role of the national labs in advancing AI. And I was just interested whether you have thoughts on the national labs, how they fit into the picture of basic and applied science, and perhaps also, do you see this very strong link to AI, or is there maybe a broader remit here?
Well, first, I'm happy he recognizes the value of the national labs, and I hope he can channel his enthusiasm is not overridden. But in AI in particular, well, it comes from all sorts of things, right? There's a lot of small, groups that have done this. But the national labs have been investing for many decades on supercomputer technology and how do you transform this. And so that is a role that has been there for many decades. And so it remains one of these things where how do you transform the compute power into something that could be beneficial in not a basic science but applied science. And so I think, and I would agree with him that this was a very important role, and I applaud his wisdom in saying that you don't want to give this stuff up. You also don't want to give up universities, by the way. Also very important. It's all part of the ecosystem we have, and it's a pretty good system, and so it works.
Thank you. Well, actually, some of the questions coming in are actually building on exactly this theme that we've started to go down about AI. I think a lot of people were struck with the childless cat person, the very young childless cat person in the left photo, as was I. And what I think some of us maybe thought you were heading a bit in the direction of is if we can run on 70 watts these incredible machines that are our brains, is there a chance that we're actually overestimating the increase in the energy demand growth? So I think there's an interest in clarifying, were you wondering whether instead of going like this, we may be going kind of like this on the energy demand?
Totally different architecture. Of those 70 watts, 35 are going into the brain. It's remarkable, that the biology has decided this is really worth investing in, and so. So to me, it's an existence proof. We haven't stumbled on anything close to the right architecture and the training data and all these other things, and drawing inferences on far less data. You don't need bazillion parameters. And so this, to me, is a very exciting adventure. There are, some very clever inroads of ways to compute in radically different ways, but they're at a very rudimentary level. And so right now, most of the horsepower is being just do the things we know, stick, and improve the art. But in the end, I take this as really a grand challenge. It's very exciting if we can get 70 watts to do what children's brains do. Amazing, because most of the AI we want is in recognizing patterns, in drawing inferences. And the other thing which machine learning does not do, it's good at interpolating. But the human brain, in some exceptional cases, can make gigantic leaps. Or take something from one field and stick it into another field, which has never been done before. AI searches for what's been done. And so that's something that we want to teach all our students. How do you, and teaching the history, when I teach science, physics, I actually put a lot of history in there, because if you don't understand what went in the creation process, you won't see, it's magic. It doesn't find its way in tech experts. There's a lot of stumbling around. And the stumbling around process is something we should also teach. To the professors out there, you'll be employed. Well, I'm not sure, but you should be employed.
All right, let's go with one last question. It takes us in a new direction for now. Maybe it'll continue over further discussions. And it's come from, I think, about 200 people in the audience today, but it's been encapsulated by a brilliant person who's integrating the questions. How will our withdrawal from the Paris Agreement impact global climate efforts?
It's going to say, well, if the United States is very wealthy and has the resources to make investments in this, and it has the intellectual horsepower, if they're not doing, why should we? Or maybe we won't push as hard. And in the end, it's also about economic advantage. When I was Secretary of Energy, I was saying, ideally, if you get EU, China, and the United States to agree and to work towards a price in carbon, and just do that, others, the developing countries won't be disadvantaged. Their carbon footprint is very small, so you can do this. And then the economists would say, well, what about those who don't play? And say, well, we can adjust tariffs. They say, oh, that's against World Trade Organization. What they were really against is being proactive on climate change. Lots of reasons why you shouldn't do this or that and the other thing. And so Now they've come around since 2009, 2010. Many of most of them, but I think we were, and Obama and Xi Jinping had negotiated a deal, the Paris Accord, which was a big deal, and so if we pull out, it's going to slow things up, and it'll give other people an excuse not to push as hard, because the countervailing push is if you do it in a clumsy way, the price of energy will increase, the price of things might increase more rapidly than they were going to without doing anything. And so you need to do this in a very astute way so that you minimize the costs. In the end, everything I was talking about was, I'll end with this quote. And when I was secretary, I quoted a former Saudi oil minister, Sheikh Imani, and he said the Stone Age did not come to an end for lack of stones, and the oil age will not come to an end for lack of oil. And I said he's a former Saudi oil minister, but that's not why he was a former Saudi oil minister. He meant that when you discover a better technology, you make the transition. So you go from stones to metal. You don't look at the stones in the ground and says, if it wasn't for the politicians, we have these stranded assets. And so if you invent a technology that's just plain better, cheaper, it's going to take over. And so we need to ultimately do that. If I hear we have all the technology we need, we just need political will, defines it as we don't have that technology. It's not better, cheaper. Think of the car. The rapid transition from horses to cars occurred over 2 decades. Entirely new infrastructure had to be built. Why? Because in cities, you're covered in poop and horse manure and horse urine. And so someone invents a poopless carriage, and it takes over. The poop of carbon dioxide is a little less visible, but you need a better technology, and so in the end, it's going to be technology that's going to win. Government can help push it, but in the end, it's got to be better technology.